Seaman Bartlett Laffey, a recipient of the Civil War Medal of Honor, has had 2 warships named in his honor. The Bath Iron Works in Maine constructed the second Laffey as a summer-class destroyer. Before making her valiant stand on April 16, 1945, the USS Laffey, DD 724, had already established a stellar record since her commission on February 8, 1944. The ship went to action in the Pacific after taking part in the Normandy landings in France in June 1944, where the sailors engaged German ground batteries and supported the men ashore with gunfire, text did. In contrast to Normandy, where the German Air Force was noticeably missing, Laffey's crew had to contend with a fierce air battle off the Philippines, specifically at Leyte and Lingayen Gulf, as well as at Iwo Jima. Laffey's crew encountered kamikaze aircraft for the first time in these battles, and while they managed to escape unscathed, the officers and young sailors under the command of the talented skipper, Commander F. Julian Becton, an Arkansas native and member of the Annapolis class of 1931, saw firsthand the terrible damage that a single suicidal pilot, let alone a whole swarm of them, could cause by deliberately colliding with a ship. Everything broke loose. On April 16, 1945, off the island of Okinawa, which is approximately 350 miles south of the Japanese home islands, the crew's most traumatic event took place. The destroyer's radar screen abruptly filled with blips as Laffey prowled the waters near Picket Station No. 1, the northernmost and hence the most dangerous of the 16 picket stations around Okinawa. 22 kamikaze planes separated from their fellows to assault the ship over the course of the next 80 minutes. Laffey's gunners, who had received excellent training from Becton, splashed the first 8, but as the narrative that follows shows, the next 4 decimated the ship's aft section. For Laffey, the first quarter hour of the combat had gone smoothly. The first 8 kamikazes had been eliminated by Commander F. Julian Becton's deft maneuvering and the accuracy of the gunners, but the afterdeck's 25 minutes of pure hell left survivors in a state of shock due to the attack's intensity. Over the course of 3 terrifying minutes, 4 distinct enemy aircraft, 2 from port and 2 from starboard, converged on the destroyer. Laffey took 4 punches in an incredibly short and lethal burst, much like a boxer taking a succession of blows. Commander Becton described the kamikazes that attacked his Laffey after the first 8 had been shot down as coming in thick and fast after that, beginning with the 9th plane. All hell broke loose, wrote Fire Controlman 3C George R. Burnett, in an attempt to explain what happened to his parents. They all started to dive on us at once and poor little us all by ourselves out there. So you can see we didn't have much of a chance because they were coming from all directions and you just can't shoot every way at once. And he continued. Adolescent Quartermaster Tutsi Aristides S. was at the bridge. Following the initial 8 kamikazes, they came in groups of 1s and 2s, said Ari Footrides. They nearly seemed to wait for their turn. We had 7 Vals, IGD-3A, circling overhead at one point, but they didn't attack us until a few more entered. They did everything they could, including diving from the sun, flying low, and rushing in. Actually, a lot of them tried suicide dives after bombing runs on us. They all strafed as they came in, he said solemnly. The soldiers who ran the ship's communication system, including the freshly added Fido crew, were under the command of Lieutenant Lloyd Hull, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's Naval ROTC in the CIC beneath the bridge. He left Becton and the men on the guns to handle affairs outside the CIC and concentrated on his primary duty, which was to gather and communicate to Becton the information he required, including targets spotted and the number of friendly aircraft in the area, if any, so that he could make the snap decisions he needed to. While radio men and others operated the communications equipment that connected the ship to the flagship, other ships, and the outside world, radar men mapped surface and air targets while the fight raged overhead. In addition to relaying information provided by Hull to Becton and other receivers, crew members known as talkers informed Hull of any updates they got over their circuits from the overworked lookouts on deck. Hull and the others in CIC, like sonarman Daniel Zach in Mount 52, worked in a closed environment, unable to see the fight going on outside. At least Hull and his crew could monitor the progress from the radar displays and any incoming messages, unlike Zack. Although Hull wished he could have watched more, and was aware that a kamikaze could destroy his CIC at any time, ending his tenure as an officer, he focused on his work and made an effort to assist Becton, and, eventually, his shipmates. The main way he could contribute to the fight was by keeping the information flowing to the bridge, as without it, Becton would be heedlessly piloting his spacecraft. Hull wondered how his pals on deck fared when he transitioned from radar men to talkers. In some respects, he wished he were above, sharing the dangers with those he had commanded and those he had become close to. But he knew he was lucky to work in CIC, where the bulkheads shielded him and his men from the bullets and shrapnel that would surely sweep the decks with every crash. Low-flying aircraft are difficult for long-range radar to detect, even though it can detect objects up to 60 miles away. Becton relied on the youthful eyes of the ship's lookouts, the majority of whom had just graduated from high school because his SG surface monitoring radar had already been turned down and his CAP was still AWOL. Becton would be on his own until CAP showed up and put themselves in the way of the kamikazes and Laffey. An impact that is fiery. One of his keen-eyed lookouts saw a Judy Yokosuka D4Y approaching low on the port side around 8:45 a.m. In an attempt to destroy the bridge area, the pilot banked slightly as he approached and then aimed at the middle section of the ship. The troops on the port side guns were shocked that the aircraft gave the impression that it was approaching them slowly. Even fact, the Judy, equipped with a 1,750-pound bomb, was racing in at over 300 miles per hour. One step up from gunner's mate, 2C Lawrence H. Lieutenant Joel C. Youngquist inspected the soldiers on his crews of 40mm and 20mm guns. Almost immediately as the kamikaze was detected, Seaman Tom Fern and the other men had opened fire on Ski Delowski's 5-inch cannon on the main deck. As the plane bore in, Fern and his friends resisted the urge to duck beneath the waist-high shield and held their ground, vulnerable to the pinging bullets all around them. Lieutenant Frank Manson watched the kamikaze, unsure if it would head straight for Youngquist's gun or veer toward the bridge and him, as Becton made periodic course adjustments to keep the plane away from the ship's crucial midsection. The ship's final line of defense, the portside 40mm and 20mm guns, were essential to survival at this point in order to bring down the aircraft. Manson remarked, "You pray he won't take you with him when he dies because you know he's the kamikaze pilot going to die." Despite having seen earlier suicide assaults in the Philippines, Manson described this one as blood-chilling because of the desperation and fanaticism he saw. War is more terrible than it has ever been because of the madness of these kamikazes. Seaman Fern gave his gunners 4-shell clips, which they fired as quickly as the loader inserted them into the guns. The fast tat-tat-tat-tat of the 20mm guns and the pow-pow of the 40mm guns were accompanied by the clanging of spent casings into bins on deck. Bullets from the aircraft retaliated by pinging off shields and mounts, which caused sparks to ignite and sliced into human flesh and bones. As they tried to bring down the low-flying aircraft, Laffey gunners' bullets created hundreds of splashes in the water, giving the impression that crew members might hop from ship to plane. The aircraft was nicked by tracers and trembled as 20mm rounds punctured the wings and fuselage, but gun operators with the target in their sights were astonished as it arrived. Fern and everyone else would be a part of a blazing eruption that would turn the aft area into their death pyre if they couldn't hit the plane within the next 5 seconds. The 40mm and 20mm guns fired 430 rounds in 30 seconds, yet the kamikaze pilot continued to fire. As the moment of contact drew closer, men around Fern reflexively raised their arms to protect their faces. The plane just missed Fern and the gun crew at Mount 44, rising just over them and passing just behind the motor whale boat that was cradled in its cradle. Burning gasoline spurted from the shattered wing, igniting a roaring inferno as its landing gear and a portion of one wing collided with Group 23's 2 20mm guns near Fern. The rest of the aircraft crashed near the ship after toppling over the starboard side. Men struggled to make sense of what they had just seen. After the battle, Lieutenant Manson wrote, "The shock, the flash of flame, the split second of awful silence, suddenly torn by the cries of injured men and the impassive voice of a bosun on the bullhorn. Fire after deck house. The knowledge that it had truly occurred. The agony of realizing that, despite her might and protection, Laffey was just as susceptible to death and destruction as any other ship. Everyone in and around Lieutenant Youngquist's guns felt a loud shock from the plane's crash and the explosive force of the bomb attached to its fuselage, which reverberated throughout the ship. Seaman 1C Robert Powell believed a freight train had just slammed head-on into Laffey when he was throwing depth charges over the starboard side to keep fires from setting them off. The blast's intensity threw Seaman 1C William L. Lake Donald beneath a torpedo tube and out of a 20mm gun mount. The sailor regrouped and joined his comrades, uninjured but shaken. Men were trapped in a deadly conflagration as intense heat and flames engulfed the deck and mounts. One guy was decapitated, numerous others were injured or momentarily blinded, and electrical lines that connected neighboring stations to the bridge were severed as shrapnel tore through human flesh and metal fixtures. Fighting the fires on the United States Laffey. Each time a kamikaze crashed into Laffey, the impact dispersed gasoline throughout the surrounding region. On the superstructure deck, 8 feet above the main deck, the flammable material inundated Youngquist's gun mounts. It swiftly caught fire and engulfed troops and equipment in a firestorm. Directly over on the starboard side, Seaman 1C Ramon Pressburger's Mount 43 sustained significant damage from the fire, and Youngquist's Mount 44 and his 20mm cannons were rendered inoperable. Ammunition lying close to the 40mm and 20mm guns was cooked by the flames, producing a fireworks show that pierced hundreds of holes in the superstructure deck. The cache of explosives designated for Youngquist's gunners was in danger of catching fire as gasoline and flames swiftly rushed through those openings into the handling area beneath Mount 44. In addition to burning or severing electrical cables and causing toxic fumes to rush through the venting system into the engine room, the fire also extended into the men's quarters and a restroom below deck. After providing first aid to a soldier who had been seriously injured by shrapnel from the explosion, Youngquist assembled 4 men to combat an imminent threat, a cache of 40mm ammunition clips with 4 shells that were positioned close to the cannons. Most personnel in the vicinity of Youngquist's position would be maimed or killed if the majority of the unused ammo detonated, drastically decreasing the likelihood that the ship and crew would survive. Youngquist, Fern, machinist's mate, 3-OC Donald J. Hintzman, Seaman 1C Charles W. Hutchins, and others rushed to the shells and started throwing the clips over the side. Despite suffering from severely burned and blistering hands, they threw the munitions into the ocean, disregarding their own safety. Lieutenant Youngquist stated, "At first, we used bare hands. Next, we covered the hands with cloth. Our actions were based on instinct. This is not what we were trained for." Although the men made every effort to decrease the stockpile, they were unable to get rid of all the shells and gun emplacements. Ammunition began to detonate as fierce fires drew nearer. More gasoline and flames poured down to places below as razor-sharp shrapnel slashed into personnel and materials and blasted more holes in the deck. Youngquist coordinated attempts to contain the fires that tore through the aft section of the ship and stop further damage to the destroyer, despite the aerial strikes by other kamikazes. The officer instructed the men to spray cooling waters onto blazing plane wreckage, unspent 40mm shells, and the fires that had extended from his deck to places below his gun position. After they snatched hoses off the main deck amidships and hurried to Youngquist's superstructure. Before directing streams of water onto the worst area of the fire, Tom Fern treated a wounded guy and ignored the exploding shells and raging fires. He remarked, "I was just trying to stay busy." Fern was more afraid of the gasoline the enemy planes carried, which, when they struck the Laffey, produced an enormous fireball, than he was of the bombs aboard the planes. "I was trying to keep my mind from what was happening. You were dead if the fireball reached you within 60 feet. There was no point in looking for cover anyhow, since there was nowhere on the tiny ship for him to do so." As he fought the fires, ship serviceman WW2 Jim D. Matthews was blown into the ocean by the force of one explosion. He narrowly avoided being sliced to pieces by the ship's propellers as Becton made another turn, but the cooling seas swiftly put out the flames that covered a portion of his body. Fearing that he would be struck by falling aircraft fragments, shrapnel, or strafing, Matthews floated in the water and watched the fight unfold around him. Matthews swam over to assist the metalsmith 3C Rex A Vest with his jacket after Vest was blown overboard as well. After the battle, the two stayed in the water until they were rescued by a rescue vessel. The kamikaze had cartwheeled over the top of Mount 43, the starboard 40mm gun right across from Youngquist after striking his mounting. The gasoline sprayed over the mount, igniting troops. The gun captain, gunner's mate Robert Carr, and Seaman 1CKD plummeted to the deck below as the majority of the gun crew clambered over the side of the mount. His pointer, Jones Jr., struggled to escape. The two crawled on their stomachs around the gun tub toward the aft stack as exploding ammo blasted past, clinging to the deck to avoid the flames and the fire. When Carr and Pointer arrived at the gunner's shack under Mount 41, the forward 40mm gun nearer the bridge, Carr took a moment to gather himself and say a prayer. Carr took comfort and strength from the situation and proceeded to the main deck, where he assisted in tending to injured troops. You could see fighters or dive bombers advancing on you everywhere you looked. Youngquist, Fern, and their companions' valiant efforts had temporarily put out the fires and kept Laffey from erupting into an uncontrollable conflagration. The fact that other kamikazes would soon be racing toward the mauled ship to carry out the coup de grace, however, was too evident for Becton to ignore. After the fight, he remarked, "They like to find cripples." Becton looked skyward and later stated that everywhere you looked, you saw dive bombers or fighters converging on you. He was unable to conceal the flames or the black smoke that curled upward from the damaged destroyer, making Lafayette an appealing target. Because the smoke towering above us marked us a crippled ship. You had no choice but to hope that your gunners would capture them. Becton recalled his promise after witnessing Japanese planes destroy 2 ships, while he was in grave circumstances in the Solomons. Although striking a crippled ship may have made the Japanese lick their chops, they found out we were far from knocked out, and would soon discover that we'd give them a fight. Targeting the fantail gun crews and Dulowski's 5-inch mount, the following 2 attackers converged on Youngquist's rear as he and his troops fought kamikaze No. 9 fires that had consumed much of his gun position. Before being identified, kamikaze No. 10, a Val dive bomber, had come within half a mile of the ship. The pilot arrived so abruptly that Dulowski's soldiers had no opportunity to turn and fire the mount, because he flew so low to the surface that some crew members feared the waves may smack the jet down. Only a few shots were fired before the plane was on the 3 20mm gun crews on the fantail who were left to defend. As the kamikaze sped toward them, they stayed at their posts in the gun mount and fired gamely, the pilot returning their machine gun bullets with his own. While American 20mm shells ripped off parts of the Val, and Japanese slugs clanged against the deck and mount shields, the suicide-bent pilot blasted through the smoke and hail of bullets from the previous kamikaze to hit radio man Lawrence Kelly and the rest squarely. Lieutenant McCoon, the ship's executive officer, remarked of the gunners, "You know, some of those kids have more damn guts." McCoon wished for Laffey's safety, as did everyone else on board, saying, "But it doesn't make any difference how good they are. They stayed right in that gun mount and kept firing. You simply cannot have them all." The landing gear of kamikaze No. 10 carved a 2-foot deep and 3-foot wide hole in the deck by grinding into the fantail directly inboard of the starboard depth charge rack. The jet crashed into the forward and aft gun shields surrounding Kelly and his shipmates, taking out Group 25's 3 20mm guns and sending pieces of soldiers and machinery flying into the air. The kamikaze then struck Dulowski's Mount 53 in the starboard aft corner, where the plane and its bomb exploded, tearing apart the pilot and sending pieces of the aircraft flying forward and aft. The impact ripped enormous holes in the mount and the surrounding deck, blew the gun mount cover upward several feet, made pits in Dulowski's gun barrels up to 11 to 2 inches deep, and ignited additional fires that quickly joined those putting Youngquist's men in risk. More gasoline and flames poured into the crew's cabins below through the deck holes, causing extensive fires that destroyed personal belongings and cut off electrical and hydraulic supplies. No. 11 kamikaze. On the starboard side, kamikaze number 11, another vow that had approached within half a mile of the ship before being discovered, dropped a bomb that detonated 2 feet inboard, breaching the deck plating and leaving a 6-foot square hole in the starboard edge. A cannon that had already been severely damaged by the previous kamikaze was further destroyed when the pilot and plane broke apart as they crashed into the metal mounts, crushing people and igniting fire against Dulowski's Mount 53's starboard side. More kamikaze pilots awaited their turn, as more flames converted Laffey's aft section into a conflagration and black smoke rose to the sky. Dulowski yelled to coxswain James M. after choosing the next target for his pistol. When the kamikaze struck, Frenchy Lapointe rotated the gun 135 degrees. Dulowski was standing in the open door on the side of the mount when the explosion threw him 15 feet away from the mount and upward. Dulowski would have been blown out into the flames if Lapointe had turned the gun another degree or two. If Lapointe had turned it just a bit less, Dulowski would have been thrown over the side and into the water. Rather, he fell on the depth charge thrower of the port K gun. The horrified gun captain was shocked to discover that he had only sustained minor burns and scratches when he came to, still draped over the K gun. He arose slowly as men threw unexploded shells over the side, still groggy from the blast, and staggered back to the mount. Near his damaged cannon, Dulowski heard a familiar voice groaning, "Ski, please help me." Coxswain Chester C. Flint, his closest buddy, was trapped to a bulkhead by the engine of the plane that crashed into the mount. Dulowski attempted to save the stricken Flint, but his friend passed away before Dulowski could do so. Dulowski had no time to grieve since Seaman 1C Herbert B. Remsen, another member of his crew, was consumed by flames 10 yards distant. He saved the sailor's life by turning Remsen around and putting out his flaming clothing. The seaman returned to the action despite having his face, left arm, and hair burned. Seaman 2C Merle R. Johnson was thrown from the mount and burned on fire by the same explosion. Johnson remarked, "I woke up on the port side hatch to the head. I was on fire, so someone was spraying me with salt water." Crew members with hoses sprayed Johnson with streams of water to put out the fire, and then they carried him to the wardroom, where Darnell and his helpers gently took off Johnson's jacket because the zipper had fused with his skin. "I lay in front of a blower from the engine room, and I was burned all over," Johnson recalled. "My burns felt better in the warm air." Johnson's fight was done. The preacher with 2 religious names, boatswain's mate Calvin Wesley Clower, shuffled to the wardroom for treatment after being burned and nicked by shrapnel. After glancing at the bustling Darnell, surrounded by mutilated, injured, and dying men, he turned back to the horse. He didn't need treatment as much as his shipmates did. He decided he could take a little pain. Fern was fighting kamikaze number 9 fires across the deck when he heard a sailor yell, "Plane going in!" Fern turned to see kamikaze number 11 only yards from the ship, as men dispersed to avoid the plane, and water sprayed from abandoned fire hoses in all directions. As the plane struck gun 53, Fern jumped over the edge of the mount to the deck, releasing heat that severely burned Fern and burned numerous crew members. Later on, Fern mentioned shoes, belts, flak jackets, and helmets. Lieutenant Jerome Sheets was killed in the explosion, and everything else was completely burned away. Even though he was partially blinded by smoke and had flash burns on his face, Fern went back to the gun mount, got his hose, and sprayed water on the burning regions until he was too weak to be carried away to see Dr. Darnell for treatment. Together with the consequences of his injuries, Fern's intense concentration on his duty caused him to lose all memory of what had happened until after the war. Fern's shipmates later told him what he had done while he was receiving treatment for a brain concussion on a hospital crew. Meanwhile, a new danger emerged. When Baker 1C William H. Welch arrived at the bridge, he reported that the 5-inch shells kept in the ship's handling rooms behind Mount 53 were in danger of catching fire due to fires. Before the powerful shells tore Lafoyan in two, Welch hurried back in time to open the valves and pour cooling salt water into 3 ammo rooms after Becton granted him permission to flood the rooms with salt water. Personnel and equipment in the aft portion were severely damaged by the 3 kamikazes. The majority of the crew members operating the fantail 20mm guns were killed, including radio man Lawrence Kelly, whose calming Irish tenor voice had frequently delighted the crew, and gunner's mate 1C Frank W. Leighton Jr., who had previously refused medical attention for a shrapnel wound and now died at his post. Dulowski's steed was severely damaged. Frenchy LaPointe and Chester Flint were among the 6 men who had died in the flaming inside of the mound, while 6 more had been burned and had internal injuries. Youngquist's firearms were rendered inoperable by fires and explosions. After kamikaze number 11 crashed into Laffey, Becton remarked, "The entire stern of the ship was under a coil of smoke." A horrible bombing run. Kamikaze number 12 launched its attack just 1 minute after the preceding pair. At 8:48, another Val emerged from the sun in a steep glide, approached from the stern, leveled off close to the water's surface, and turned toward the ship, while Laffey's guns were pointed starboard. In what seemed to be a long line of kamikazes ready to take their turn at his ship, Torpedo Man's mate Fred Gemmell observed another plane strike from his position at the starboard side, K guns. Gemmell stated, "Planes coming in, guns firing." You listened to what was going on and where the shooting was coming from. I remember thinking that I really wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to go. A bomb launched by the pilot landed on the port quarter above the propeller, punctured through the deck, and exploded in a 20mm ammunition room after the ship's 20mm guns near the aft stack fired 120 rounds at the aircraft. As he flew to starboard and vanished over the horizon, the pilot, who had evidently chosen to dump his bomb without colliding with the ship, avoided heavy bombardment. The destruction from the single bomb was astonishing. 3 feet inboard from the ship's edge, the bomb pierced a 7-foot hole in the deck, wrenching the main deck upward, as damage control workers fought raging fires dangerously near the after magazine. It stoked new fires and fueled those that were already burning. All of the guns aft of the ship's number 2 stack were thus rendered inoperable. Fires quickly spread throughout the sailors' quarters and storage facilities after the bomb exploded in the 20mm magazine after breaking through the main deck breach. Deadly shrapnel was thrown at the deck crew by the explosion's force, which forced portions of bulkheads and bunks from the ship's interior upward and out via hatches. The bulkheads of 7 adjacent compartments, including the carpenter's room, steering gear, motor room, and steering gear room, were punctured or ruptured by shrapnel below decks. The explosion of the bomb tore bulkheads off their hinges, endangered the areas used to store munitions, and created dense smoke that made damage control efforts more difficult. Water poured through the bomb bits that pierced the ship's skin and deck, flooding the rear end. Becton thought it was more concerning that the explosion affected the ship's steering and made it more difficult for him to manage. The ship was turned 26 degrees to port when flying debris broke hydraulic leads in the steering gear room beneath the fantail, jamming the rudder. The ship steamed in a never-ending circle with the rudder locked in place, giving Becton only one option for evasion: mislead the enemy by changing his speed quickly. Becton noted that the ship swung through tight circles with full engine power still available, so evasive maneuvers were limited to rapid acceleration and deceleration. Now, like a wounded fish, Laffey circled wildly. Becton was in a bad place. On 3 sides, 4 kamikazes had crashed into Laffey's aft quarter. He was no longer able to move. The ship's stern was no longer covered by guns, and his attempts to alter speed were hampered by water in the aft sections. A flaming mess of mangled steel and dead crew made up the back portion of Laffey. It would only be a matter of time until the end came, unless Becton's damage control teams were able to contain the water and the fires. After the battle was over, Lieutenant Manson wrote, "Now Laffey circled crazily like a wounded fish, with black smoke coiling above her like trailing viscera." Becton concurred. Becton remarked, "We felt like a sitting duck, but we weren't exactly one." Seaman Andrew Martinez was in the aft steering room, just below the fantail, and Becton attempted to get in touch with him, to ask whether he could steer from that post, because he was unable to manage the steering from the bridge. Becton had to send 2 men aft to check on the situation because the attack had cut off the telephone cables that connected them. Lieutenant Theodore Runk, who had been in charge of coordinating the firefighting activities aft, departed at the same moment to try to free the jammed rudder. Working his way through bodies and wreckage, he paused to throw an unexploded bomb overboard. He arrived, and he and Martinis vanished into the aft steering room, which was already smoke-filled from the adjacent burning 20mm ammunition handling room. "We had trouble breathing," Martinis remarked. Runk would cover his face with a wet handkerchief, breathe, and then hand it to me. Runk and Martinis passed the wet handkerchief back and forth to protect their faces from the smoke and flames, and discovered that the attack had severed the hydraulic lines that led into the emergency steering room. Martinis tried to dislodge the jammed rudders by moving into the steering gear room behind the steering room, but he was unable to do so. "For us, the smoke was growing thicker," Martinis remarked. The two departed before their air supply ran out because they were unable to release the strain on the rudder and provide Becton with complete mobility. After the battle, George Burnett emailed his parents, "Well, that jammed our rudder all the way over to port. So we had no guns aft to shoot with, and we were doing 30 knots around in circles." Becton was in a dire situation. Top speed would exacerbate the already dangerous situation for the destroyer, but he needed it to evade the kamikazes that would undoubtedly approach. He made a more attractive target for the kamikazes if he slowed the ship to allow his damage control teams time to fight the fires. During the rare lulls, a handcuffed Becton slowed the ship, and whenever Lookout signaled the approach of another assailant, he shouted for maximum speed. The inspection by the quartermaster. Becton requested that Quartermaster Ari Fautrides leave the bridge for a brief survey of the area in order to get a clear image of the damage aft. Fautrides stepped from the bridge to the main deck on the port side below, and he weaved his way slowly aft among the rubble, dead, and plane wreckage that covered his route. Seaman 1C Marvin G. Robertson carried a bloodied Seaman 2C Walter Rory to the wardroom for treatment, despite having severe injuries to his head and back. Fautrides walked past the charred remains of a fellow shipmate. The man's face was shielded by his arms and hands, and he was immobilized in a charcoal rigidity that represented his last failed attempt to repel the burning gasoline. Fautrides approached the fantail without stopping, carefully moving aft alongside Dulowski's Mount 53, which was now more of a burning, dented piece of metal than a weapon of war. Fautrides remarked, "I then noticed the damage to the 20mm guns on the fantail. A man was bleeding and still in his straps, with both legs gone. Fautrides was appalled to see the man's legs laying on the deck near the gravely wounded sailor, but he rallied to help those who hurried to his side. 'Please get me out of these straps,' he begged, still alive. The man passed away before they could free him from the straps." Radio man Kelly was among the group of dead from the fantail that lay grotesquely among the rubble just feet away, silent witnesses to the slaughter caused by the kamikazes. According to Fautrides, "I saw 5 of them, all in different positions, and one was flat on his face." He mentally noted everything he saw: the smoke and fires, the cries of the injured, the quiet of the dead, the burning cannons and mounts, the decks pierced with hundreds of holes. All of them were simply lying there. At the time, it didn't really hit me. I received very little response, Fautrides remarked. After that, I turned back toward the bridge and began to consider it. I realized all of a sudden that I didn't want to see it again. Fautrides believed he had seen the worst until he came upon 3 men just forward of gun 53 while returning to the bridge along the starboard side. It was more gory than the 20mm fantail weapons, and the group had been hit. The 3 were waiting for orders or something at a post together after being on damage control. They were struck directly by a plane. Only fragments and pieces of them remained. Fautrides pushed the graphic image from his thoughts and proceeded to the bridge. He met his friend John Schneider, a torpedo man's mate, along the route. "How's it going?" I inquired as I walked by him. He remarked, "Greek," Fautrides' nickname. "I would crawl under this ship if I could find a piece of rust." Before the quartermaster finished his examination and reported to Becton, Footreides and Schneider exchanged a modest chuckle over the comment. He gave a gloomy synopsis. A mass of flames covered the main deck, as well as the superstructure deck aft, which housed many of the ship's guns. The decks were damaged with holes ranging from inches to several feet in diameter by enemy planes, bombs, and shrapnel. Every gun aft had been destroyed or severely damaged. The fantail was all the way down in the water and still going down farther, and engines and bits of the aircraft stuck out from gun mounts and below decks compartments. Flames on deck and flooding below decks threatened to wreck Laffey before further kamikazes had a chance, as smoke billowed skyward. But there was still hope. Delowski stated, "Laffey still made steam and continued moving in a circle. Even though our radar was gone, the rudder was jammed, and practically every compartment aft of the stacks and engine rooms was flooded. However, we were on the go. Getting the Laffey back. Before their nightmare came to an end, Laffey's crew had to fight 10 more aircraft, despite the damage caused by the 4 kamikazes in less than 5 minutes. Others ran through heavy gunfire to further damage the destroyer, as gunners splashed additional enemy planes before they crashed into the stricken ship. After the final kamikaze had finished its run, the majority of the crew found it hard to believe their ship was still afloat. Smoke rose to the skies, wounded and dead sailors sprawled on charred, blood-soaked decks, as flames tore through gun mounts and raged below decks. Throughout the seemingly endless 80-minute battle, Laffey was hit by 3 bombs and 5 kamikazes, and 2 bombs were near misses. Of her 336 crew members, 32 were killed, and over 70 were injured. After the destroyer was safely brought to port by tugs, Commander Becton was able to make temporary repairs that allowed him to make his way across the Pacific to Seattle, where he was welcomed by the public and media. The Navy Department allowed the public to inspect the ship, with her shattered gun mounts and perforated decks, to remind citizens that the war was not yet ended. After being repaired, Laffey participated in the 1946 atomic bomb test at Bikini Atoll, Operation Crossroads, as a support ship. She received 5 battle stars and the Presidential Unit Citation for her service during World War II. Laffey was decommissioned and sent to the Reserve Fleet on June 30, 1947. Following a FRAM-2 fleet rehabilitation and modernization conversion in 1962, Laffey, who was recommissioned in 1951, got 2 combat stars during the Korean War and served in the Atlantic Fleet until its decommissioning in 1975. Together with the carrier USS Yorktown, CV-10, which was put into service in 1943, the Valiant Laffey, the sole surviving summer-class destroyer in North America, has been berthed at Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum in Charleston, South Carolina since 1981. The public can still relive that valiant April day 70 years ago by walking Laffey's decks. In 1986, she received the title of National Historic Landmark. In his 1980 book, The Ship That Would Not Die, Becton, who resigned from the Navy in 1966 with the rank of Rear Admiral, described the Laffey's experiences.